The key factors, the takeaways that we had were that these costs, the subset of costs that we're actually able to identify and quantify attributable to fracking activities, uh, does get us up into the millions of dollars a year, easily tens of millions, and talking about billions of dollars when we're looking at the cumulative effects over time. So we're talking about costs on society that are on the order of magnitude of the amount of employment associated with fracking. So as much as we hear about the benefits of fracking activity in terms of job creation in places like Pennsylvania, the subset of costs that we can identify and the subset of costs that we can actually put a dollar value on is up to that scale and probably quite a bit higher. I think as we walk through the consequences, the health effects, which have a lot of pathways to people in terms of groundwater, surface water, air quality, it's a little bit hard to tease out the specific chemicals and the specific pathways, but there is a preponderance of evidence that the actual statistical changes in health outcomes for communities that are close to high concentrations of wells are quite strong. We're looking at, in this report, where there are specific financial health expenses associated. But we all know that that's only a small piece of the puzzle. So, for example, if we're looking at the costs of hospital treatments for low birth weight children, that's one factor, but that's really minuscule in the scheme of what parents consider the overall consequences of having to worry about the health of their children. So I think I would also emphasize when we're walking through the cost that we're able to quantify here, this fact that we are trying to focus on where there's information available and dollar values available that we can associate with them, that we're probably missing some of the big consequences. Again, thinking about some of the specifics, sleep disruption, depression, we can quantify some of the effects of those adverse consequences via expenditures, lost workforce productivity. One of the situations that we're dealing with here is trying to trace these effects through to what people would really care about and how they can think about these consequences. So I think it's important, if you're looking at this report, this kind of information, is not to focus on the dollar values as much as to try to understand what the effects are and then recognize how the dollar values give us a sense of their magnitude, but recognize where the dollars don't tell us the whole story. So migraines are an example of an effect that we're seeing a pretty strong increase in the rate of migraine occurrence for people who live close to these wells. There's a whole range of potential disruptions in a community when you have this sort of temporary, very boom and bust kind of economic activity that comes in. So it's often very specialized. It's often difficult to fully incorporate or build in the local labor force, and when they do, it can have secondary consequences for other industries. If you're trying to achieve some level of economic development, you want some sustainability, and this is sort of the opposite of a sustainable industry when we're thinking about the actual drilling activity, the fracking activity itself. So it's often that there's a fair amount of crowding out in terms of housing, in terms of labor force, congestion, in terms of infrastructure, roads, wear and tear. And if you're bringing in people from outside the area, they're often disconnected. They don't have a local connection to the community. They don't have friends and family. There has been plenty of information around increases in crime rates, drug use associated with areas with this kind of temporary and non-local labor force that can come in. big picture question about this sort of focus on a resource extraction industry and the kinds of jobs that it can encourage, and the kinds of businesses that are affected by it in the positive ways, in comparison to other economic development strategies for these areas. So if you've got non-local oil and gas businesses coming in, bringing in labor from outside the area, it's a short-term burst. They don't have any real commitment to the community, to the region, to the resources of the area, and there might be this short-term burst in spending that can have some temporary benefits. But if you're thinking about the long-term consequences in the area, we're seeing that property value goes down. People don't want to live near these wells. Other jobs are negatively affected. Tourism and just sort of general attraction in many of the region can go down. So you see these long-term negative effects on other industries and just the overall appeal of the region. That increasingly in the U.S., what communities are trying to do is compete for for businesses that pay good jobs, that employ highly skilled workers, and those highly skilled workers want to live places where they can raise their family, where they feel like it's a healthy place, a safe place, a strong community. And so you've got problems whereby both existing businesses are going to be harmed through this activity, existing labor forces, but you're going to have a hard time attracting some of those more resilient long-term industry and skilled workforce that areas really want. I think there's also the long-term effects of this sort of boom and bust cycle for an economy in a region. There's something that we often see, especially in the Midwest, where I grew up in Ohio, where you've got areas that had boomed and the infrastructure, the downtown areas, the businesses all expanded dramatically around some single industry, and then when that industry goes away, there's a lost sense of community and a lost sense of economic vitality that can be very difficult to overcome. You see this in extreme cases like Detroit, where trying to step back from a build-out from a larger level of population and economic activity, and that can be very expensive and difficult to achieve, and people tend to leave in that situation. So there's a potential that fracking activity, especially in these counties that have had very concentrated well development, are going to have a long-term challenge to maintaining their community, their infrastructure, their baseline industries, their households, their housing supply. It can be very disruptive to housing prices when you've got big swings in overall population. In terms of the environmental consequences of this fracking activity in Pennsylvania, first of all, you have to understand what the pathways are that fracking can affect the environment and habitat in Pennsylvania, that the well pads where the drilling actually occurs, from a surface area perspective, is a potentially large total area of landmass, particularly given that it's often in agricultural or even forested areas. So we're talking about probably around 100,000 acres or so that's affected directly. So there's direct disturbance there, not to mention all the traffic and the activity, the light, the noise, the sound, and its effect on wildlife populations in the vicinity. But then in terms of direct functions of natural capital, natural ecological systems in Pennsylvania, we'll see disruption from this surface activity as well as subsurface activity, and that's where things get complicated. So first of all, there's sort of some direct disturbance that can occur, and contamination from chemicals and disruption to the natural systems. But then we have a whole range of potential long-term bioaccumulative effects and contaminations of surface water, aquatic habitat, and then via some of the air pathways, we've got other contaminations of ecosystems in Pennsylvania, which can again have disruptive effects for birds, wildlife, fish populations, and there are recreational benefits associated with those. People in Pennsylvania care about having native wildlife that's healthy and active. Hunting and fishing is affected by those kinds of consequences. And ultimately, I think there's a potential loss of faith in the reliability of the resources that Pennsylvanians depend upon, their drinking water supply, their groundwater. We're already seeing that in terms of avoidance or averting behavior, where people are using more bottled water in Pennsylvania. People don't trust their groundwater wells. People are selling their homes. The effect on property value of being close to a fracking well, particularly if you rely on groundwater, is substantial. And we're talking about over $1 billion in property value that's been lost that way already. And probably more, because it's often hard to isolate those, the whole set of consequences for willingness to pay for homes when you're in an area with all sorts of disruptions and potential unsafe environment for your family. Same effects of fracking that can translate through to negative consequences for public health can also affect the attractiveness of recreation opportunities and really demand both from residents and potential tourists. Recreational fishing in Pennsylvania is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and plenty of surveys have shown that people are not willing to go to parks, to go fish, to hunt in areas that are close to wells. They don't trust the effects, and it's generally a lot less attractive in terms of the environment. So recreation is an important industry as a whole. Outdoor recreation in Pennsylvania is an important industry as a whole, not just for the overall magnitude and the expenditures and the overall economic impact in the state, but it's also important to residents directly and some of the intangible benefits they have, from access to a clean, attractive environment, trails, streams, mountains, forests near where they live. And if they don't feel like those are safe places to go, or if they're just noisy and loud and being disrupted by drilling activity, that makes the place just less attractive as a place to live, to work. And so it also can translate through to business attraction, business retention, and workforce attraction and retention. So the agricultural industry has been affected already by fracking in Pennsylvania, not just in terms of removal of productive farmland from the overall land base for agriculture, but also in terms of contamination. There have been plenty of examples of spills, soil contamination, water supply contamination in Pennsylvania, and those are just the ones that have been identified. So again, there could be this taint effect whereby agricultural production from these areas is seen as unsafe, and demand could go away. People might not be willing to buy produce from these areas. And I think as we see potential increases in overall numbers of wells that are active and overall disruption, there could be these bioaccumulative effects that again are difficult to trace. But if there's even uncertainty around the safety, the demand and the prices that farmers in these areas are going to be able to get for their produce is going to be very uncertain. And I know if I was a farmer, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near a well. So just in summary, when I think about this report, which was really a review of existing information and data, it tells us that communities in Pennsylvania are affected by fracking in all sorts of different ways and at almost every level, that homes, that households, that individuals, that businesses, that local agencies, that regional environments, ecosystems, natural resources. There are ways that fracking can negatively affect all sorts of resources and members of these communities. So I think each community has to look at what fracking means in their community and whereby fracking could have negative consequences, and whether those risks are worth the potential benefits that might be advertised. There are there are going to be differences from one place to another. There are going to be situations where wells are directly affecting water supplies, are close to people. But even in the areas where we don't know that there's a direct connection, there could be this long-term effect. So if I lived in this area of Pennsylvania and I was looking at this report, I would use it as a checklist or even a starting point to start to think about all of the ways we would want to evaluate any proposed new drilling or continued drilling in my community.